All right, good morning. It's time to talk about the Constitution. This is it. We are on the downward spiral, as it would be. You guys are about to graduate. You have survived a weird period in world history, to be sure. And so it's time to talk about the last unit we're going to discuss in this civics course. And that unit is going to deal with the Bill of Rights and amendments. The only other kind of component of our government and constitution that we haven't really delved into. Just to kind of give a framework of the next couple weeks, we have the rest of this week and then 6 days after that of new material, and that'll be it. So the plan is going to be for today. I'll just kind of talk about the background surrounding amendments and the process of amending the Constitution. You guys will look into the actual amendments themselves tomorrow. Excuse me. And then from there, we're just going to spend that next week looking at examples of where the amendments kind of come into question, how we interpret them. And then we'll close it out with a documentary about due process here in the United States. So that's our plan. We're almost done. You've almost made it. You just have to bear with me a little bit longer. So with that in mind, we're going to get right into today's lesson on amending the Constitution, and more importantly, why we have amendments to begin with, which is our first question. And so the best answer to this, I think, comes from a quote by one of the founding fathers themselves. This is a quote by Thomas Jefferson. And when thinking about why do we have amendments, or why is it that we can change how our government works, he put it best, I think, when he said, "Nothing is more likely than the enumeration of powers," and that the, wow, I just biffed it hard. Good start for today, Mr. Mays. Let's try that again. "Nothing is more likely than that the enumeration of powers is defective. This is the ordinary case of all human works. Let us go on perfecting it by adding, by way of amendment to the Constitution, those powers which time and trial show are still wanting." And what it really boils down to is nothing is perfect. The future is unknown. We should not be so bold as to assume that we have created the most perfect form of government going forward. And I think that is an excellent example of how the Founding Fathers very much kind of learned from the situation that led them to create a new form of government to begin with. And that, yes, they left Britain because of the tyranny and their dislike of the king and his form of government. They created their own version, their new version that they thought was better. But they also acknowledged the fact that, you know, if the king could goof up, despite having been the way that Britain had ruled its country for centuries, then it's fairly likely that they probably are going to botch something as well. And so it was only appropriate that to make sure that our country could survive, we make it so that they can change the Constitution when needed, so that if some new problem that they could never have anticipated pops up, we're ready to deal with it. And it turns out that that was, generally speaking, a very smart way of looking at it, because there have been a wealth of potential problems that they never would have anticipated coming up, ranging from civil rights. I imagine it was hard for them to predict that not only would we have a civil war over the issue of whether or not we should own people, but then after we had hundreds of thousands of people die to establish that it's not okay to own people, we still would not be all right with that. And so they really would never have anticipated we need to make rules to force our citizens to be fair to each other, or to allow them to be citizens. I think the best example of this unanticipated problem comes from right after the Civil War, where when the Civil War ended, we passed the 13th Amendment that prohibited slavery, and everyone was kind of like, yeah, we did it, good, problem solved, good to go. African Americans can be free, everyone will be equal, it'll be fine. But then literally overnight, you see the South be the most petty possible and say, oh, well, they're free, but they're not citizens, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says they have to be citizens, and so they don't get any rights, and so we don't have to treat them fairly. And so they literally had to step in and with the 14th Amendment go, no, anyone who was born here is a citizen. A perfect example of, like, you wouldn't anticipate that our citizens would be so petty. Other great examples include the fact that We had to make an amendment for term limits. Everybody, for the vast majority of U.S. history, just kind of assumed that people would follow the tradition of George Washington. Why wouldn't you? He was one of the best presidents, if not the best president. Yet lo and behold, FDR finally ignores that, and so we have to be able to address that. Or income tax. It's very hard, right, for the Founding Fathers to have ever anticipated how society would develop and how much technology we would become involved with, how important cities would become, and centralized education and a need to pay for that in a way to make sure everybody can interact with each other, because their society just wasn't that big. The concept of a city like New York holding 8 million people, when that was like the population of the United States, was unfathomable. Yet here we are in a modern society where we need to have a way to pay for these public services. And so income tax had to be that solution. All of these things are continual examples of how they could have never foreseen where society would go, but at least they anticipated that that would happen. And so all of this is outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. And if you recall, Article 1 is the legislative branch, Article 2 is the executive branch, Article 3 is the judicial branch. So like it was pretty far up there if you think about the ordering. They basically said, all right, 3 most important things, how our government works, and then one removed from that, how we improve that government and the system we have in place. We're trying to make sure that we can change our Constitution if we need to. And so in it, they outlined all the different ways that they thought it would best be allowed to amend the Constitution. This is important because amendments are a large portion of your rights. So, starting with methods for proposing amendments. The first one is that 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to vote yes to propose an amendment. So, like any representative, so Senate or House, can propose an amendment just like a law, and then if 2/3 of both the houses of Congress say, yes, we think that this is a worthwhile amendment, then it will go to get ratified. So this is just like everybody agreeing that, yes, this is a thing that we should vote on and the country should have a say on in as to whether or not it becomes an actual amendment to the Constitution. This system has been used for 26 out of the 27 amendments to our Constitution. And it's primarily because it's just the easiest way to propose an amendment. And I'll kind of expand on that a bit more. But the other option is that 2/3 of state legislatures have to petition Congress to call a national convention to propose an amendment. And in our history, all 50 states at some point has started one of these petitions. Sorry. So Illinois, Hawaii, Alaska, doesn't matter. At some point, all of them, their state government has written up this petition and have tried to pass it around to the other 50 states saying, here's an amendment that I think we need to have in the Constitution. However, none of them have ever successfully had a state convention called. And what this really boils down to between these two methods is a case of efficiency, and that's about it. Like with method 1, the 2 houses of Congress, to successfully get an amendment approved, you have to get 290 people in the House of Representatives and 67 in the Senate. So overall, you only need 357 people to agree that this is worthwhile. In comparison to where, with option 2, you need to get all or 2/3 of all of these state legislatures to agree to that. So already you need to get at least 34 of the states to agree to this. And then within that, you have to get the state legislatures to approve that. And their legislators mirror that of the federal government, where they have multiple hundreds of people serving in the state legislature, representing different areas. And so just the sheer volume of people you need to get on the same page is way higher for these. And so that's part of why it hasn't succeeded. But also the other major issue is that how these two groups are divided. The House and the Senate are divided along party lines. They're either Democrat or Republican. The state legislatures are divided around a ton of other things. Yes, Democrat and Republican, but they're also divided by their geographic needs. Like the farming states tend to care more about farming bills. The more urban states, like New York, care more about urban things. The states that are more associated with oil drilling, like Texas, they care more about that than, say, California does. And so all of these different states have a huge number of things vying for their attention. And so they're even less likely to all agree exactly on what is an amendment worth considering. Whereas when you look at the federal side with the both houses of Congress, you really just need to get the Democrats on side because of how our political system works. Generally speaking, Democrats back Democrats. And so if you have a 2/3 majority in both houses with Democrats and Republicans, or a close one, and some people who kind of sit on the middle of the line, or you have a really good idea, it's a lot easier to sway them to your particular opinion. And so that's why 99% of all of the amendments have come through option number 1. And so then that brings us to the methods for ratifying. So that first section is just to propose it. So it's basically just everybody sitting down and agreeing, yes, these are good amendments. We need to now send it to the states and have them decide. Because while the federal government can propose an amendment, at the end of the day, it is always the citizens and the states themselves that approve amendments. And so the first option is that 3/4, so 38 out of the 50 states have to approve the amendment, and the state legislatures. So again, those people, the governor, and like the Illinois House of Representatives, those are the ones that have to vote if we're going to say, yes, this is a good amendment, let's add it to the Constitution. And that has been used to ratify 26 of the 27 amendments. The second option is that state ratifying conventions in 3/4 of the states have to approve the amendment. And this was only used to ratify the 21st Amendment, ironically the one repealing prohibition. And I say this is ironic because these two systems suffer from the similar issues that you see with proposing amendments, where state ratifying conventions are just like a pain to get going and get set up. It's a lot easier to just get the state governments, the state legislatures to approve it, because for a ratifying convention, traditionally what has to happen is that there's a set window, usually about 60 days, in which the state government has to hold a state election to elect ratifying delegates. And so what will happen is they'll pick anywhere from like 14 to 30 delegates or representatives for the state, and then they'll send those delegates to this ratifying convention where they all sit down together, and then those delegates, those chosen citizens rather than elected politicians, will have to sit and debate as to whether or not they want to approve this amendment. And there's just so many more steps because first, you have to decide who your delegates are going to be. So those are usually appointed by the state legislature, which already seems like it's one step too many, right? Because if the state legislature is going to pick the delegates, why not just have the state legislature vote to begin with? But they got to pick all the delegates that are going to be up for election. And that could be a number that's a lot larger than the number that you need. So there's choice for the citizens. Then you need to send it out, and all the citizens need to vote. And then once you've done that, you need to notify all of the representatives, and then they have to give them a date. Say, okay, this is where and when you're going to have the convention. And then you got to get them all to the convention. And then you just have to wait because there's no rules on how the conventions are going to work, usually, other than there's a chairperson and there's a secretary who takes notes. The rest is entirely up to the interpretation of the delegates that are there. And so it's just all of these steps when instead you could just say, all right, House of Representatives, you guys already vote on stuff all the time. Do you want to approve this amendment? It's also easier because, again, when you pick a lot of different citizens, they have a lot of different things that they care about. A Chicago citizen has very different values than a Flanagan, Illinois citizen, as is readily apparent by the number of people complaining about the quarantine and saying that Chicago should become its own state. However, state government officials, again, are traditionally only divided by the political parties. So if you're all Democrats, you're probably going to agree. If you're all Republicans, you're probably not. or you're all probably going to agree. You're not going to agree with the Democrats. But if you pick and choose people from all over the state, you just get a really weird amalgamation of people with a lot of different beliefs. Again, Illinois, perfect example. I went with Central Illinois, but imagine like, okay, you take someone from Louisville or like deep Southern Illinois, which is basically Missouri, and someone from Chicago or like Northern Illinois, that's basically Wisconsin. They're going to have drastically different expectations for what they want out of an amendment. And it's going to be a lot harder to get them to agree. And so we see option one consistently being the one that is used to ratify amendments. So now I want to get into just a couple other components about amendments. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was the timeline of amendments. Because if you look at this, out of the 27 that we've had, there's a trend that you should hopefully notice. And that trend is, if you look at these dates, the United States overall has this weird trend of passing amendments in clumps, and usually after major world or major national events. So like you look at the Bill of Rights, the 11th Amendment, and the 12th Amendment. These are all within a very short time period, and it's right after our country is founded. And if you were to look at what those amendments actually do, their purpose is to solve some of the immediate problems that they didn't anticipate. Then we go like 60 years until 1865, which, if you recall, is the Civil War. And then we have a group of amendments, 13, 14, 15, being passed right after the Civil War. And again, what do you know? They all have a theme: citizenship and freedom for slaves, and like not being cruel to them. Then we take another big gap, and you see 1913. We see 1919, 1920. You can group all those. Oh, look at that. World War I. Big pivotal moment in global history. Once again, we're making some decisions. The year before and the years right after. And then again, we accelerate just a little bit. So not as big a gap, but another major event. Great Depression, 1930s, boom, 2 more amendments. Big pivotal moment in US history. And then we take a break for World War II, but then right after World War II, again, boom, Cold War era, whole series of amendments all over again. Some major conflicts: Korean War, Vietnam War, the fight against communism, like all of these big moments in US history taking place in this kind of immediate time period. And then we drop off again, and then you only see one from 1992, and then that's it. Nothing else. But if you also think about world history, we haven't really had any sort of major events other than 9/11. And even then, it doesn't really compare. And so what you should hopefully see is that a recurring theme for the United States and our ratifying amendments is that we really don't touch the Constitution, like ever, even though we have the ability to do so, except in massive pivotal moments in our country's history. And I mean like truly massive things that are entire units of study on their own to historians. And so that leads to some very important facts that I think should be considered, and where I kind of want to end our discussion for today, which is that to say that we haven't ratified a lot of amendments because we don't propose a lot isn't accurate. We actually have thousands of them to date, as far as we've recorded, and our records of this are not good. We think there's around 11,000 different amendments that have been proposed, but only 33 have even made it through the 2/3 votes in the Houses of Congress. And then from there, only 27 have actually been ratified. And to put this into comparison to other countries, Germany has passed 50 new amendments since 2003. They ratify a ton. France, same deal. Since like 2005, I think they've done like 35 amendments. So both the countries have ratified more new amendments to their constitution since after 9/11 in the past 17 to 15 years than we have in the entire history of our country. And so the question is, why? Why is it that we ratify so few? And now, granted, some of them, it's because they're not worth ratifying. For example, a radical socialist in the 1920s proposed that we abolish the Senate and only have the House of Representatives. That did not go over well, did not make any progress. But other ones are like pretty reasonable propositions. Like one of them, there's a proposed amendment that would make it illegal to burn the American flag. Pretty popular, still hasn't happened. Or another one in more recent years was proposed that we should get rid of the natural born citizen component of the president requirement, that as long as a citizen has been naturalized and met all the other requirements to be president, they can run for election, to really embrace the diversity of our nation. That also has not made it through the 2/3 vote. And so this enters into like the really big question again, like why do we continue to not make ratifications? And the biggest answer is that because we're a large country, and like very large, and very little about our amending process is designed to account for a growing country. If you look back at those methods of ratification, both of them require state legislations to approve them. And that's just a lot. Like we talked about, there's a lot of different people that you need to get to agree to all of the same thing. Similarly, we've traditionally just had a very large political divide because of how our government works and how our politics work. It's been very much Democrats versus Republicans. And it's very uncommon that one political party holds power in both houses of Congress by a large majority. In fact, it almost only ever happens after major crises in US history. And lo and behold, that's also when our amendments happen. After the Civil War, Republicans dominated the government because they won the war. And look at that, we had some amendments. After World War I, Wilson's party dominated elections. Again, look at that, they made some amendments. During the Great Depression, we see a huge flip to Democrats after the Republicans, and Hoover let the country down, and they have huge popular support. Boom, more amendments. And so that's kind of the reoccurring theme and the lasting message. And something to consider when talking about amendments in our country is that we have been divided for a very long time. And while people like to talk about how our political divide is problematic, there's also very clear evidence that that is a problem. There have been a wealth of amendments proposed, many of which are worth considering. Yet we only have 27, and we haven't ratified a new one for 22 years. Lo and behold, also during one of the largest times of a political divide. And so as we continue to look at amendments, that's something to keep in mind, is that there are very real consequences to our political divide, as can be seen in our inability to improve this living document like our founding fathers wanted us to. So with that, that'll wrap up my discussion of amendments 4 through 8. Tomorrow, you guys will be looking into each and every one of those 27 amendments and what exactly they are all about. I'll email out those instructions to you later. Otherwise, if you stuck all the way to the end, thank you for staying here with me. I have been told by Anna that I really need to tell you to like and subscribe my videos because that's what good YouTubers do. So there it is. Please do so or don't. Really up to you. And have a wonderful rest of your day. See you.